I've always been a huge fan of the Super Smash Bros. Series, and one of the most appealing parts, to me and many others, is the roster. So predicting and crafting hypothetical lineups of our favorite characters is part of said appeal. While many others simply make concepts for their ideal Smash 6 roster, or guess what the next game may look like, I'm interested in finding different ways to make the roster more unique. I present to you, what if Super Smash Bros. Was created today? Alright, before we get started with the actual roster, let's cover some quick guidelines. Number 1, no third parties. As much fun as it could be to predict which of gaming's legends would get onto the roster, I'd rather not cover it for now. While I'm sure we'd get some characters like Sonic, Pac-Man, Mega Man, or Hero, I'm not going to be covering them here, for the sake of Nintendo character diversity. Number 2, no echoes. Echoes have so many possibilities, but I'm not going to be covering them either. Clone characters are some of the hardest to predict, and I think it'd be better to just stick to the main roster. Number 3, we don't know the devs. We would have no idea who would develop this game. It may be Sakurai, it maybe not. And even if I chose somebody, we wouldn't be covering any quote-unquote bias picks. Number 4, no deep cuts. For the first game, I would want to stick with the bigger names from better-selling series. So some series prominent in our Smash Bros. Would likely have at best a small cameo. Series like Earthbound or Kid Icarus would fall victim to this. And that covers the main guidelines. I doubt these would all be true if this reality had existed, but they're simply lining out a simpler path to build this roster. With that said, let's get on to the actual roster. I've decided to go on the higher side for characters, with a roster of 44. Nintendo can be on the ambitious side with serious projects, but if this is a bit too high, I'll be going over which characters I think are the most expendable at the very end. So which series is first? I'm sure nobody expected Mario to make it onto the roster. But honestly, he needs no explanation. He's Nintendo's mascot and the protagonist from their best-selling series. So, with that popularity, he'd easily be able to be accompanied by a few other iconic characters. Bowser, Princess Peach, and Toad are some of the Super Mario series' most iconic characters. Bowser's been the main antagonist for the Mario series for over 30 years, and Peach and Toad have been there just as long, always helping or being saved by Mario along his journeys. Bowser, Peach, and Mario would all have new tools from their most recent games, lacking in Super Smash Bros. Toad would play using his power-ups and items he finds in Captain Toad games, appearing in Smash for the first time. And with a more basic starting roster, no new and popular characters like Rosalina on the Wii would be high priority. Toad would finally get a chance to join the fight. Now I'm sure most people have noticed quite a few important characters not on the roster. But Mario's made so many other franchises that they would all get their own character slot representing their series. Luigi, Yoshi, and Wario have all had their own successful series, being Luigi's Mansion, the Yoshi series, and WarioWare respectively. They all offer enough unique moveset inspiration, something true for basically every character on the roster. This time, however, Luigi's moveset would have more of an emphasis on using tools from his series rather than being a weird rehash of Mario. The Mario series has quite the number of characters on the roster, taking up 16% of the roster. But it's well deserved. I'm sure more people could name some of Mario's more obscure characters like Waluigi or Bowser Jr. than they could iconic characters from other important franchises like Samus or Fox. This roster isn't all Mario, however, and I think everyone can agree that Pokémon has just as much of a spot on this roster as Super Mario, being one of the highest selling medias of all time, so I think it's important to get some popular Pokémon on the roster. Pikachu is the obvious mascot, but who else would be added to this lineup? Once again, in a situation where the hot new characters haven't been top priority, it allows for a bit more diversity in the roster. I do still think we would get a Gen 9 Pokemon though. Without Incineroar on the roster like in our Smash, I think Meowscarada would have a fair chance of getting onto this roster, being a more popular Pokemon of Gen 9, and it would be a way to get an actual starter on the roster. Sylveon also seems like a pretty easy pick to me. Eevee has been pushed as a second mascot, and with Sylveon being one of the most popular fairy types and evolutions, I think it makes sense for them to get a spot on the roster. And they may never see it for not being quote-unquote relevant going forward. Team Rocket also works as a solid antagonist to the Pokémon series, one we just don't get in Super Smash Bros. While you could use some generic Grunt or Giovanni, I do honestly think Jesse and James are more iconic from the anime. They could use Meowth as a primary attacker, with a few other Pokemon like Wobbuffet coming out for a few attacks. As for the last Pokemon, I'm not 100% certain. I think we would get another Pokemon, though I'm not so sure who. Mimikyu and Gardevoir are both super popular Pokemon, but I'm worried about the type overlaps with Sylveon, especially when there's only 5 Pokemon. Lucario also works as a relatively popular pick, but it feels like that popularity has mostly died out by now. I just in the end chose Mimikyu because it's my personal favorite of the 3, but any of them would work. While we're at it, let's knock out every other Smash 64 character appearing in this game. Donkey Kong is a must-have, being one of the first Nintendo characters in their library, and he still remains as one of their best-selling series. He would be drastically different than how he plays in Smash, however, having far more real attacks and items he uses in his games, rather than the basic bruiser archetype that he is. However, he can't be the only one from the Donkey Kong series. It's one of Nintendo's best sellers, not to mention how popular Diddy Kong is. He even got his own game back on the N64. Diddy Kong felt obvious, but I think Dixie Kong would have a great shot too. She served as a sort of third main character since the Super Nintendo, and as much as I would love to include King K. Rool, he just doesn't have a major presence anymore, and while I'm sure requests would flood in for him quickly, he doesn't seem like he'd make the base roster. Next up, we have the Legend of Zelda series, with just some awful representation in Super Smash Bros. This time around, most characters would be designed around a mix of Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, and Hyrule Warriors. Link, Zelda, and Ganondorf are all must-haves. Link would mainly consist of things he could do in the last 2 games, donning his Tears of the Kingdom design, and luckily in this game, Ganondorf would actually get to be a completely original character, with all of his unique abilities rather than a generic strongman moveset. These 3 aren't all though, as Impa would appear taking her Age of Calamity design, with a moveset built heavily off of that game. Impa remains as one of the only common reoccurring characters outside of the main Triforce trio, making her a solid 4th option. Metroid as a whole has gotten less and less popular over time, but not to the point where it's unrecognizable. The series has been quite dormant as of late, outside of Metroid Dread, which is how Samus would appear unless Metroid Prime was shown anytime soon. Unfortunately, that seems very unlikely. Despite it becoming less prominent than it was a few decades ago, Metroid is still one of Nintendo's main franchises. And with Metroid Dread, I think that there's a solid chance Ravenbeak could be playable. Serving as the main antagonist in the latest entry, I've seen plenty of people throwing around Ravenbeak as a possible option, and I can see why. While others may put Ridley here, I think Ravenbeak's recent creation, not to mention a much more manageable size, as again, this wouldn't have something like Smash Ultimate to work off of, I think Ravenbeak's got a pretty fair chance. Kirby is one of Nintendo's biggest stars, with such a colorful and interesting cast, and they have sales to back up that cast getting multiple members into this hypothetical Smash Bros. But at the end of the day, Kirby, King Dedede, and Meta Knight are the main 3 characters of the series, and I think they would unfortunately be the only ones present in the first game. While I could see an argument being made to have Bandanity or maybe Dark Matter replace Meta Knight, I don't think either can compare to his popularity. Star Fox is one of the series that has struggled the most over the past few decades, not producing much, and what was produced never did the best. I can't reasonably justify giving this series more than just Fox. Had it at least had some relevance, maybe Falco, Wolf, or Crystal could have gotten on the roster, but the series hasn't gotten any games on the Switch and doesn't have a large enough presence anymore. The same thing happened to F-Zero, except much earlier. Yet, despite no new games since the GameCube, it still remains as one of Nintendo's 30 best-selling franchises. And when some of them don't have any real characters, like Clubhouse games, I think Captain Falcon has a fair spot on the roster. It's sadly more than Earthbound will ever get. I'd like to quickly look back at sales. Mario is obviously number 1, and Pokémon is number 2. The Wii series is number 3, though they don't have a real character to represent them outside the Wiis, which, yes, they would be in the game. Number 4 is The Legend of Zelda, so what is number 5? Is it maybe Kirby or Donkey Kong? Maybe something older that sold a lot, like the Game & Watch? Well, it turns out that it's Animal Crossing, a series I constantly see people say doesn't even deserve 2 characters in Smash. Not only that, but Animal Crossing New Horizons on the Switch is their 5th best-selling game of all time, over every Zelda, Kirby, and Donkey Kong game ever made. So with that said, I think getting 3 characters is something Animal Crossing has earned. Isabelle and Tom Nook both feel like very easy choices, as they're likely the 2 most recognizable characters from their series, and for a 3rd character, I could have picked Villager, but I think the actual characters would fit far more. So, I chose KK Slider, who could have a more musical moveset, something no other Animal Crossing character could offer. Splatoon, despite being made less than 10 years ago, is already one of Nintendo's most successful series, and they would absolutely get a character in Smash Bros. Or even two. I think the Inkling and the Octoling would both be able to bring a large arsenal of different weapons to the table. I imagine the Inkling would have more weapons based off the first two games, while the Octoling would have some more unique weapons, primarily focusing on some of the new stuff added to Splatoon 3. At this point, there are only two more series with more than one character, and I know very little about both of them, so let's knock them out. Fire Emblem has had enough of an impact to get a character, and with Three Houses selling the best and being on the Switch, I think it's quite fair that Byleth gets the character slot. There is, however, another more recent game, also released on the Switch, being Fire Emblem Engage, which I did have to look up the name of that. So I think Alear getting in is also fair. I do think both of these characters could be replaced by Edelgard and Marth respectively, however. These are just the two I thought fit the best. Xenoblade has the same situation, with a good selling game being Xenoblade 2, but a more recent game, Xenoblade 3, both on the Switch and with different protagonists. I think we could simply see Rex and or Pyra, and then Noah and or Mio. Again, I don't know enough to go much deeper than that. From here on out, I'm just gonna go in order from most to least sales. The Game & Watch series would have Mr. Game & Watch invented for this game, similarly to how he was invented for Melee. At the end of the day, the Game & Watch is one of Nintendo's most notable pieces of history and sold tons of games, and is absolutely one of Nintendo's most important franchises. After that is Nintendogs, another series without a proper character, but I think a basic Nintendog would work just fine. And it does deserve some attention, as nearly anyone who had a DS had Nintendogs, except for me. From one dog to another, Duck Hunt is just as important to Nintendo's history as the Game & Watch, and just as recognizable as the Nintendogs. The Duck Hunt duo, I think, has a really good shot at getting in this fictional roster. Ring Fit Adventure feels like it shouldn't be in the best-selling list series, above things like Star Fox and Xenoblade. It has only one game on the Switch, but that just shows how successful the game was. If the Wii Fit Trainer made it onto our Smash, then the Ring Fit Trainer definitely could make it onto the roster of this hypothetical Smash Bros. Pikmin feels like an essential Nintendo series at this point, and I'm sure sales will increase significantly with the addition of Pikmin 4. The real choice was if I would include Alf, Olimar, or the currently unnamed Pikmin 4 protagonist, Nochi. For now, I decided to stick with just Alf. While Olimar has more personality, and I think the new protagonist is more modern, I think Alf's presence on the Switch, and being an actual named character, a trait we don't believe the Pikmin 4's protagonist will have, I think Alf is the standout choice. But I could see any three of them making it into this hypothetical game. Two series within the top 30 bestsellers that I'm surprised don't have a character already are the Excite series and the Rhythm Heaven series. So I decided to include the Excite Biker and the Tap Girl. While other people may suggest the Chorus Kids or Karate Joe, I feel like the Tap Girl can be seen as a sort of mascot, so I chose her to represent the Rhythm Heaven series. Now, after all that, I have one other slot open. I wanted to choose a good selling game on the Switch outside of the bestsellers list, but really, the only one I could consider would be ARMS. In the end, I added Twintel as the final character choice, but I could see her being replaced by a more popular and or older character like Captain Rainbow. What do you think? After some thought, I believe if some characters were to miss the cut, these would be the ones at highest risk. So, do you think my approach of this concept was bad? Who do you think would be on the roster? Comment down below, and if you enjoyed, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It really helps out a new channel like mine. And if you want to be notified when I upload in the future, click the bell icon, because I'm going to be covering characters who didn't quite make the cut for this final roster in the near future.